Daniel Harper walked down the long metal corridor without paying attention to where he was going, and his mind was somewhere far away thinking about Earth and the life he left behind 3 months ago when he accepted the assignment on this alien planet called Kepler-4 to be, and the diplomatic wing of the human settlement was quiet at this hour, with most people either sleeping or busy with their own work, and Daniel liked it that way because he preferred being alone with his thoughts rather than making small talk with strangers. He had been a lieutenant in the human space program for 5 years now, but most of that time was spent doing boring paperwork and attending meetings that could have been emails, and when the chance came to work on an actual alien world, he jumped at it without thinking twice, and now here he was walking these corridors every night, unable to sleep and unable to stop thinking about everything that had changed since humanity discovered they were not alone in the universe. The galaxy had opened up to humans 15 years ago when the first alien ship landed on Earth and brought news of thousands of species living among the stars, and at first everyone was excited and hopeful, but Daniel quickly learned that the universe was not the friendly place everyone hoped it would be, and there were empires out there that made human history look peaceful by comparison. And some nights he wondered if humanity had been better off alone. He turned a corner still lost in thought, and that was when it happened. Daniel walked straight into something solid and stumbled backward, catching himself against the wall and looking up to see what he had hit, and his breath caught in his throat because standing before him was the most unusual being he had ever seen. She was tall, much taller than any human woman, and her skin had soft glow like starlight was trapped just beneath the surface, and it was pale as snow, but with hints of purple that seemed to shift and change as she moved, and her hair fell past her shoulders in waves of pure silver that looked like liquid metal, and her eyes were the deep purple of space itself, ancient and knowing and a little bit sad. Her ears were pointed, sweeping back from her angular face, and when she steadied herself after the collision, her movements were so graceful and smooth that it seemed like she was floating rather than standing, and Daniel realized he was staring, but he could not help it because she was like something out of a dream or a nightmare. He was not sure which. The woman tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made his heart beat faster, and he felt like she could see right through him down to his very soul. And when she spoke, her voice was strange and beautiful, like music that no human could ever make, with sounds that seemed to echo and harmonize with themselves. She asked him a question that made no sense, and yet somehow felt like the most important question anyone had ever asked him. She wanted to know if he found her beautiful. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out at first, because how do you answer a question like that from a complete stranger in the middle of a corridor at night? And behind her something massive moved in the shadows, and his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he realized with shock that there was a dragon. An actual dragon. The creature was coiled in the wide corridor like a living river, and its scales shimmered with blues and greens that reflected the corridor lights, and it was enormous, taking up nearly the entire width of the hallway. And its eyes were the same deep purple as the woman's eyes, and those eyes were fixed on Daniel with an intelligence that was clearly not animal. The dragon did not move, but Daniel could feel its presence like a weight in the air, and he suddenly understood that this creature could kill him in an instant if it chose to, and the only thing stopping it was the woman. Standing between them, he looked back at the woman and realized that she was still waiting for an answer to her strange question, and something in her expression told him that this was a test of some kind, though he did not understand what kind or why, and he decided that lying to her would be impossible anyways. So he told her the truth. He said yes, and added that she was extraordinary. A small smile appeared on her lips, but it was sad and knowing, and she looked at him like she felt sorry for him. And then she said something that sent ice down his spine. She told him to run. She said he should run away before he got tangled in a war that would consume entire worlds. Then she moved past him, and the dragon followed behind her, flowing like water made of scales and ancient power, and Daniel stood frozen in place, unable to move or think or breathe, as the scent of something sweet, like flowers mixed with ozone, lingered in the air where she had been. He did not know her name. He did not know why she knew his name, because she had called him Lieutenant Daniel Harper without him telling Herbert. He knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever, and nothing would ever be the same. Again, Daniel stood there for a long time after she was gone, trying to process what had just happened, and his hands were shaking and his heart was still racing, and he realized that he was afraid, but also excited in a way he had not felt in years. He walked back to his quarters slowly and spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about purple eyes and silver hair, and a question that felt like it meant something more than the words suggested. The next 2 days passed in a blur of routine work, and Daniel kept expecting to see her again around every corner, but she seemed to have vanished completely, and no one else in the settlement mentioned seeing anyone matching her description, and he started to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. But on the third night, the alarm started screaming. Daniel was in his quarters when the sound erupted through the settlement, and it was the kind of alarm that meant serious danger, not a drill, and he grabbed his uniform jacket and ran toward the command center along with dozens of other people who were all running and shouting and looking confused and scared. The command center was chaos when he arrived, with people rushing around and holographic displays showing things that made Daniel's blood run cold. There were ships in orbit, massive ships that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. Designs were strange and organic looking, like they had been grown rather than constructed, and they had appeared without warning, dropping out of hyperspace right above the settlement, and now they were just sitting there waiting. Commander Paul Hendricks was shouting orders, and Ambassador Laura Mitchell was trying to establish communication, and everyone else was running around, preparing for the worst, and Daniel stood near the back of the room feeling useless and scared. Then the transmission came through. A face appeared on the main display, and Daniel felt his stomach drop because it was clearly the same species as the woman he had met in the corridor, and this one was male with the same pointed ears and glowing skin, but his eyes were like burning coals instead of purple, and his expression was cold and cruel. The alien spoke in a voice that was translated by the computer, and he said they were looking for someone, a fugitive, a criminal, a traitor to their empire, and they demanded that the humans surrendered this person immediately or face the consequences. Ambassador Mitchell asked who they were looking for, and the alien smiled in a way that made Daniel feel sick. Then the doors to the command center opened, and she walked in. The woman from the corridor, she was wearing armor now that looked like it was made of silver and seemed to be grown onto her body rather than put on, and the dragon was with her, having to duck its massive head to fit through the doorway, and everyone in the command center stopped and stared. She announced herself in a clear voice that carried through the sudden silence. She said she was Princess Silvara Nethys of the Velkari bloodline, and she was the one they were looking for. Room erupted in shouting and confusion, and Daniel stood there feeling like the floor had dropped out from under him, because the strange woman who had asked him if she was beautiful was apparently an alien princess, and an entire empire was here to take her back. Ambassador Mitchell was demanding explanations, and Commander Hendricks had his hand on his weapon, and the dragon was growling in a way that made the floor vibrate, and Princess Silvara just stood there calm and dignified, like she was in complete control, even though she was clearly trapped. Her eyes swept across the room, and for just a moment they met Daniel's eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe your understanding, or promise that this was just the beginning. Then she started talking, and Daniel listened along with everyone else as she explained why an entire empire was hunting her, and why she had been hiding in the human settlement, and why everything was about to get much worse before it got better. Daniel realized that when she told him to run, she had been trying to save him from this, but it was too late now. He was already tangled in her war. They all were. The council chamber felt too small, with everyone shouting at once, and the holographic displays showed the massive alien warships hanging in orbit like predators waiting to strike, and Daniel stood near the back trying to make sense of everything, while his mind kept replaying the moment he had bumped into Princess Silvara 3 nights ago. Ambassador Laura Mitchell raised her hands, calling for silence, and slowly the room quieted down enough for people to think, and the ambassador turned to face the princess, who stood calmly beside her dragon, as if armed guards and angry diplomats did not bother her at all. Laura asked how long Silvara had been hiding in their settlement, and the princess answered that she had been there for 14 weeks living quietly in the lower levels and hoping that her father's empire would not find her, but clearly her hope had. Misplaced Commander Hendricks stepped forward, and his voice was hard when he demanded to know what she had done to make an entire empire chase her across the galaxy, and his hand stayed near his weapon like he was ready to draw it at any moment. The dragon that Silvara had called Nethys made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a roar, and the floor shook. And several people stumbled backward and their faces went pale, but the princess raised one hand and the dragon went quiet, though its purple eyes never stopped watching the commander with clear. Warnie Zilva explained that she had defied her father, Emperor Kelthus, and refused to marry the warlord he had chosen for her. And when he tried to force her, she fled with Nethys, who was her bonded companion and her only true friend, and her father would not tolerate this insult to his authority. Said that her father would burn the human settlement to ash just to get her back unless the humans surrendered, or immediately, or unless they chose to fight beside Hertha. Word fight hung in the air like smoke, and Daniel saw people exchange worried glances, because fighting an empire that spanned 1,000 worlds seemed like suicide, and everyone knew it, Commander. Hendricks laughed, but there was no humor in it, and he asked if she seriously expected humans to go to war with the Valkyrie Empire, just because she did not want to get married, and his tone made it clear what he thought of. That idea something changed in Silvara's expression, and her purple eyes went cold and dangerous, and when she spoke again, her musical voice had an edge like a blade. She said she was not just some runaway bride and told them to be careful with their words and their assumptions, and she explained that she was the last of the true Nethys bloodline, descended from the first dragon riders who had made peace with dragonkind thousands of years ago. She said her father hunted her because she carried knowledge he feared, and she knew about the ancient pacts and treaties that once bound the Valkyrie to codes of honor they had long since abandoned, and if she died, those truths would die with her, and her father's tyranny would become absolute across the galaxy. Daniel found himself listening more carefully now, because this was bigger than a family dispute, and it sounded like Silvara was talking about the fate of entire civilizations and not just her own personal freedom. Princess turned to address everyone in the chamber, and her voice softened slightly, and she said she would not force humans to fight her war, and she had only come to their settlement, seeking temporary sanctuary. And now she would leave and try to lead the empire away from them, but before she could say more, Daniel heard his own voice speaking, and he was surprised to realize he had stepped forward without meaning to. And everyone was looking at him now. He said they should wait and hear everything before making any decisions, and he asked what exactly her father wanted and what these ancient pacts were that she kept mentioning, and he felt his face get hot as people stared, but he kept his eyes on Silver. The princess looked at him, and something in her expression changed, and it might have been gratitude or recognition or both, and she said that Lieutenant Harper asked good questions, and that the full story would take time to tell, and time was something they might not have much of as if the universe wanted to prove her right. The holographic displays suddenly flared bright red, and an incoming transmission alert filled the room with urgent beeping, and everyone fell silent. The image that appeared made Daniel feel cold inside. Was another Valkyrie warrior, but this one was massive even by their standards, and he wore armor that looked like it was made from black metal, and his eyes burned like hot coals, and his presence was somehow menacing, even through a hologram. Warrior introduced himself as Commander Varthok, First Blade of Emperor Kelthus, and his translated voice was deep and hard like grinding stones. He said that the humans of Kepler 442b were harboring the traitor Princess Silvera Nethys, and he gave them 6 hours to surrender her, and if they refused, he would demonstrate why the Velkar Empire had stood unchallenged for 10,000 years. The transmission ended abruptly, and the silence that followed felt heavy and oppressive. Someone in the back of the room asked what would happen if they just gave her up and handed her over to her father, and the person said they had families here and children, and no one wanted a war. Silvara spoke quietly and said she understood and she would not blame anyone for choosing to protect their own people, and she started walking toward the door like she had already accepted her fate. But Daniel stepped into her path, and he did not know what he was doing or why, but he knew he could not let her just walk away and surrender herself to an empire that sounded corrupt and evil. He said that maybe there was another way, and asked her to at least explain about the ancient pacts before they made any final decisions. And he looked at Ambassador Mitchell and Commander Hendricks and silently begged them to give Silvora a chance. Laura Mitchell studied Daniel for a long moment and then looked at Silvora, and finally she nodded and said they would hear the full story and then they would vote on what to do, and everyone would have a say in the decision. Next hour was spent listening to Silvara explain things that sounded impossible, and Daniel tried to follow along even when the concepts were difficult to understand. She told them about how 12,000 years ago, her ancestors had been a simple species, living on one world, and then they met the dragons, and the dragons were not animals but beings of pure energy who could travel through hyperspace and navigate the spaces between spaces. The dragons taught the Velkari how to traverse the stars in exchange for reverence and partnership. And together, they built an empire based on balance and harmony. And for every world they explored, they gave sanctuary to another, and for every conflict they engaged in, they brokered peace elsewhere. But 5,000 years ago, something changed, and Silvara's great-grandfather discovered a way to enslave the dragons instead of partnering with them, and he used forbidden technology to bind their energy and force them to serve. And most of the free dragons fled to deep space, but some, like Nethisa's ancestors, were captured and bound in chains of light. Empire became what it was today, and it conquered and destroyed without conscience, and the dragons, who had once been partners, became tools and weapons, and Slava Silvara said she had spent the last century gathering knowledge to break those chains and free the enslaved dragons, and she had the equations of unbinding that could shatter the bonds. But the process required a sacrifice, and she would probably die completing the ritual. Dr. Helen Torres, who was the settlement's lead scientist, interrupted and asked why Silvara could not just broadcast the equations across the galaxy and let everyone know how to free the dragon. Silvora explained that the unbinding required a catalyst, and someone of royal blood had to channel the energy through their own life force to make it work, and just knowing the equations was not enough. The room fell silent again as people absorbed this, and Daniel felt something twist in his chest, because Silvara was talking about her own death like it was inevitable and acceptable, and he found that he hated that idea more than he would have expected. Commander Hendricks asked practical questions about the Empire's military strength and their weapons and their tactics, and Silvara answered everything honestly, and the picture she painted was grim, because humanity's entire fleet could not stand against even one Valkyrie battle group. She also said that if the dragons were freed, they would turn on their captors and the enslaved species across. The Empire would rise up, and the whole corrupt system would collapse. From within, Ambassador Mitchell stood up, and her face was serious and tired. And she said that everyone needed to make a choice, and they needed to make it now, because time was running out. She asked if they should hand over Princess Silvara to save the settlement, or stand with her and fight for something bigger than their own survival, even if the odds were terrible. The room erupted in debate, with some people shouting to surrender her and others arguing to fight, and Daniel listened to all of it feeling torn because both sides had valid points. Then he thought about Earth, and about all the times in human history when people had to choose between safety and principle. And he thought about what kind of person he wanted to be and what kind of species he wanted humanity to become. He raised his hand and said clearly that he voted to fight other. People started voicing their agreement, and one by one the votes were counted, and there were dissenters and people who wanted to negotiate or find a middle path. But when the final tally was done, the decision was made. Humanity would stand with the Dragon Princess. The War Council met deep underground in the Operations Center, 300 feet below the surface, where the walls were thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment, and the air was cool and recycled and tasted like metal, and everyone looked tired and scared but determined. Daniel found himself included in the meeting despite being relatively junior in rank, and he suspected it was because of his interaction with Princess Silvara and the fact that she seemed to trust him for reasons he still did not fully understand. Silver stood in front of a massive holographic display that showed their solar system, and Nethes was coiled around her feet like a living fortress, and the dragon's scales reflected the blue light, creating strange Dancing patterns on the concrete walls, the princess began speaking, and her musical voice carried easily through the tense silence, and she started telling them the full story of what the Valkyrie had once been versus what they had become. She explained that the ancient Valkyrie were not conquerors at all, but explorers and philosophers, and they spent their time studying the universe and trying to understand their place in it. And then one day the dragons came, and everything changed. The dragons were beings that existed partially in normal space and partially in hyperspace, and they could see things that other species could not, and travel in ways that seemed impossible, and they chose to share their gifts with the Valkyrie, because they sensed potential and Thema Pact was made, and Silvera pulled up ancient star charts and mathematical equations that made. Dr. Helen Torres and her science team leaned forward with sudden intense interest. The doctor whispered that these were the equations of binding, and fragments of them had been seen in Valkyrie technology, but never the complete formulas, and this was revolutionary. Ver nodded and explained that her father had suppressed the full equations because they contained rules and limitations, and the original pact demanded balance in all things, and for every action there had to be an equal and opposite reaction to maintain harmony. Ambassador Laura Mitchell asked what had changed and why the Empire became what it was today, and her voice was gentle, like she was talking to someone who had experienced. Tromi Silvara's expression darkened, and Daniel saw pain flash across her alien features, and she said that 5,000 years ago her great-grandfather became obsessed with power and expansion, and he hated the limitations imposed by the Dragon Pact, gathered the best scientists and engineers, and worked in secret for decades until he discovered a way to break the true bonds and enslave the dragons, instead of partnering with them, and it required technology that was considered forbidden and dangerous even by Valkyrie standards. Most of the free dragons sensed what was happening and fled to the deepest parts of space where they could not be found, but some, like Nethys's ancestors, stayed behind because they trusted their Valkyrie partners and believed the friendship between species was stronger than one individual's ambitions. They were wrong. The dragons who stayed were captured and bound with chains made of pure energy, and their power was twisted and forced to serve the Empire, and the Valkyrie began conquering instead of exploring, and within a few generations they had built a war machine that spanned 1,000 worlds. And Thes raised her massive head and spoke, and her voice was deep and resonant like it came from the earth itself, and each word seemed to cost her effort. She said she was the last freeborn dragon, and all her kind were in chains across the Empire, and Silvera had freed her from a research facility where scientists were studying how to breed more controllable dragons. Though dragons said they fought together for all enslaved beings, not just dragons, but every species that suffered under Valkyrie ruled. Daniel felt pieces falling into place in his mind, and he asked if Silvara was trying to restore the original pact and free all the dragons from their chains. Silvara nodded slowly and said that was exactly what she intended to do, and she had spent over a century gathering the knowledge needed to break the energy chains, and now she had the equations of unbinding. Commander Paul Hendricks, who had been listening quietly, asked why she could not just broadcast the equations across the entire galaxy and let everyone know how to free the dragons instead of keeping it. Secret Silva explained that broadcasting was part of the plan, but the unbinding required a catalyst to trigger it, and someone of royal Valkyrie blood had to channel massive amounts of energy through their own body to initiate the breaking of chains. She said the process would almost certainly kill her, but it was the only way to free all the dragons simultaneously, and if they freed them one at a time, her father would have time to adapt and create new chains, and the opportunity would be lost. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and Daniel felt something twist painfully in his chest, and he heard himself speaking before he could stop. He said there had to be another way, and maybe they were missing something, and perhaps the catalyst did not have to be fatal. Silvera looked at him, and her purple eyes were sad and ancient, and she said she appreciated his optimism, but some prices could not be avoided, and the original chains had been forged by her bloodline, so it was fitting that her bloodline should break them through sacrifice. Dr. Torres interrupted and said she needed time to study the equations properly, and maybe there were alternatives they had not considered yet. and science had a way of finding solutions that seemed impossible at first before anyone could respond the alarm. Klaxons began blaring, and red lights flashed throughout the operations center. And a technician shouted that the Valkyrie fleet was beginning orbital bombardment. Everyone rushed to the displays and watched as energy beams lanced down from the warships above and struck the settlement's shields, and each impact sent ripples of light cascading across the protective barrier. But Commander Hendricks frowned and said the attack patterns were strange, and they were not trying to break through the shields, but seemed to be doing something else. As Silvera moved closer to the tactical display, and her face went pale even by her already light standards, and she said they were not trying to breach the shields but were instead preparing a containment. Field Laura Mitchell asked what that meant, and her voice was tight with worry. Princess explained that a containment field was a spherical barrier around an entire solar system, and once it was complete, nothing could enter or leave, and no communications could get through, and the Valkyrie would essentially trap everyone inside and wait them out, she said. They could take their time hunting her while the human settlement slowly ran out of supplies, and eventually people would have no choice but to surrender or starve. The room fell into heavy silence as everyone processed this, and Daniel could see the fear on people's faces because being trapped was somehow worse than being attacked directly. Ambassador Mitchell straightened her shoulders and her diplomatic demeanor shifted into something harder and more determined. And she said they needed to make a decision immediately. She asked if they should hand over Princess Silvera to save themselves or stand with her and fight for something larger than their own survival, even knowing the risks. The council chamber went quiet, and Daniel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, and he thought about everything he had learned about the Valkyrie Empire and the enslaved dragons and the ancient pacts that had been broken. He thought about Earth and human history, and all the times people had faced impossible choices between safety and principle, and he wondered what kind of person he wanted to be. Spoke clearly and said he voted to fight others, began voicing agreement, and one by one people committed to standing with Silvera, even though the odds were terrible and the enemy was overwhelming, and Daniel saw tears glisten in the princess's eyes. Not everyone agreed, and there were people who argued for negotiation and compromise and finding a middle path, but when all the votes were counted, the majority had decided humanity would stand with the Dragon Princess against an empires. Silvera thanked them in a voice that trembled with emotion and said she would never forget what they were risking, and she would do everything in her power to make sure their sacrifice was not wasted. Commander Hendricks immediately began organizing the defense, and Dr. Torres gathered her science team to work on decoding the unbinding equations, and everyone moved with purpose. Now that the decision was final, Silvera approached Daniel directly and stood close enough that he could see the faint glow beneath her skin. And she said she needed his help with something crucial. She explained that there was an ancient temple in the northern crystalline forests, and it was built by the first dragon riders 12,000 years ago, and it was one of the few places where the barrier between normal space and hyperspace was thin enough to perform the unbinding ritual she needed. Someone she could trust to help her get there, and someone who would not try to stop her from completing the sacrifice. If it came to that, Daniel asked why she trusted him when they had only just met, and his mouth felt dry because he knew this was important. Silvera smiled sadly and said she could read people well after living for over a century. And when she asked if he found her beautiful in that corridor, he had answered with honest wonder, not desire or conquest, and that told her everything she needed to know about his character. She said she needed someone who saw beyond surfaces and asked real questions and would stand by their principles even when things got difficult. The transport skimmer raced through the crystalline forest at speeds that made Daniel's hands grip the controls tightly, and sweat bead on his forehead, and the massive crystal formations jutted up from the ground like frozen lightning, catching the light of the twin moons above and creating strange dancing shadows. Nethys flew overhead like a living arrow made of chrome and scales, and her wings barely seemed to move as she glided through the alien sky, keeping pace with the ground vehicle. Isley Princess Silvera sat in the passenger seat working frantically on a datapad, and her fingers moved across the holographic interface faster than Daniel could follow, and her face was tight with concentration and worry. She reported that the containment field was now at 70% completion, and once it reached 100%, they would not be able to transmit the unbinding equations, even if they managed to decode them fully, and time was running out faster than anticipated behind. Their skimmer to escort vehicles followed, carrying a small team that included Dr. Helen Torres and her encryption specialists, along with security personnel led by Lieutenant Maya Foster, who was one of the best soldiers in the settlement. The sky above them periodically flashed with light as the Velkari fleet continued its orbital bombardment, striking the settlement shields, and each flash reminded Daniel that there were ships up there waiting to descend and finish. This, he asked Silvara, to tell him more about the temple and why that specific location was needed for the unbinding ritual, and his voice had to compete with the wind rushing past the open skimmer. The princess looked at him, and he saw exhaustion in those purple eyes, along with determination that bordered on desperation, and she explained that the Velkari were not the first species to discover this world 1,000 years ago, when the dragons first began teaching our ancestors how to traverse the stars. This planet had been one of their sacred spaces, and it was a convergence point where the barrier between normal space and hyperspace grew. Thin Daniel thought about the equations. She had shown them earlier and asked if they were not just mathematical formulas, but also coordinates and resonance pattern. Silvera's expression shifted to surprise and then respect, and she said he was more perceptive than most people. And yes, the unbinding. It's not just about breaking chains, but about opening a doorway. In calling the free dragons back from deep space, she explained that the dragons had scattered to the void waiting for a signal that it was safe to return, and that their enslaved brothers and sisters needed liberation, and Silvara's sacrifice would be like a beacon burning across dimensions. Voice rumbled through the communication system, and the dragon had learned to interface with human technology during her weeks of hiding, and she said her people were scattered across the void, waiting for the signal, and Silvara's sacrifice would be the beacon they needed. Daniel said firmly that they were not talking about sacrifice yet. And first they would decode the equations and transmit them, and then they would figure out how to complete the ritual without anyone dying. Silvara's voice was soft when she replied that his optimism was admirable, but some costs could not be avoided, and the unbinding acquired life force from the royal bloodline because they were the ones who created the chains in the first place. Daniel interrupted and said that balance demanded justice, not suicide, and if her people created the chains, then her people could break them, but that did not mean she had to die doing it, and there was always another way. The princess studied him for a long moment, and her alien features were difficult to read, but Daniel thought he saw hope flicker in her eyes, and she said, so quietly he almost missed it, that she hoped he was right. The temple appeared through the morning mist like something from a fever dream, and Daniel had to slow the skimmer because his brain was having trouble processing what he was seeing. Massive pillars of dark stone. They spiraled toward the sky, and they were covered in symbols that glowed with soft light, and the entire structure seemed to pulse with energy, and it predated any known Velkari architecture by thousands of years. Torres's voice came over the radio, and she was practically shouting with excitement, and she said the entire temple was acting as a quantum resonator, and the symbols were not decorative, but circuit patterns encoded directly into the stone. Daniel brought the skimmer to a halt at the temple's base, where a grand staircase ascended into shadow, and the other vehicles arrived moments later, and the team began unloading equipment, while Torres and her scientists immediately started taking reading. Silvara climbed out of the skimmer with Nethes landing beside her, and together they began ascending the stairs, and Daniel hurried to keep pace, and his heart was pounding from a mixture of exertion and anticipation. At the top, they entered a vast chamber, and the ceiling disappeared into darkness above them, but the floor was breathtaking. And it was a massive circular pattern inlaid with the same glowing material as the exterior symbols, and everything seemed to pulse with a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. In the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, and on top of it was a crystalline structure that looked like a frozen flame, and it was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Silvara whispered that this was the heart of first binding, and this was where her ancestor had forged the first true partnership with dragonkind thousands of years ago, and this was also where that partnership was later betrayed. Nethes moved to the platform and placed one massive claw on its surface, and immediately the temple responded, and light raced along the floor patterns. In complex waves that made Daniel's eyes hurt trying to follow them, the dragon's voice emerged stronger than Daniel had ever heard it, and Nethi said she could feel her kin dreaming in chains and calling out across the void, and their pain was. Like a physical weight doctor, Torres burst into the chamber with her team following. And they were carrying armfuls of equipment and setting it up quickly, and the scientist was out of breath. When she reported that they had made progress on the equations, but there was a problem. The transmission alone would not be enough, and the signal needed to be amplified through a biological resonator. In it had to be someone whose neural patterns matched the Royal Velkari signature exactly, and the power requirements were enormous and would burn out any non-royal. Velkari nervous system completely silver finished the thought and said this was why it had to be her, and she had known from the beginning that this would likely be fatal, but it was the only way to free all the dragons simultaneously. Daniel felt frustration rising. He asked what would happen if they did not transmit from this location alone, and what if they used the temple itself as an amplifier, but split the power. Loathsome how he asked if Nethys was bonded to Silvera, and could the dragon share the burden of channeling that much energy Silvera? Nethys looked at each other, and some wordless communication passed between them that Daniel could not understand. But recognized as profound, the dragon rumbled that bonded partners always shared life force, and they had since the beginning of the partnership, but sharing the unbinding process had never been attempted before. Silvera said slowly that anyone who tried would be severing their own bond in the process, and it would be intensely painful and might still kill them both, but the odds would be better than certain. To Daniel pressed and asked Dr. Torres if it was theoretically possible to modify the transmission to work with two sources instead of one. The scientist was already working on her datapad running calculations, and her fingers flew across the interface, and after a moment, she said that if they modified the resonance pattern and created a dual-channel transmission, it might work. She admitted it had never been done before, but the mathematics supported the possibility even. If barely outside the temple, a massive explosion shook the ancient structure and dust fell from the ceiling, and Maya Foster's voice crackled urgently over the communication system. She reported that 3 Velkari assault craft were incoming and heading directly for the temple, and they had maybe minutes before enemy soldiers. Aravit Silvera looked at Daniel, and then at Nethys, and then at the ancient crystalline heart at the center of the platform, and her face was pale but determined. He said they had no more time for debate, and told Dr. Torres to set up the equipment immediately, and she told Daniel to coordinate the defense and keep the enemy forces away from them for as long as possible. Daniel asked what she was planning to do, and his voice came out rough. The princess smiled, and it was sad and beautiful and terrified and brave all at the same time, and she said she was going to make her ancestors proud or die trying. Daniel wanted to say something meaningful and important, but he could not find the right words, and instead he just nodded and turned to run for the stairs behind him. Silvera and Nethys moved toward the platform, preparing for a ritual that might free billions of enslaved beings or consume them entirely in the attempt. Daniel emerged into daylight and saw the Velkari assault craft descending, and they were sleek and deadly looking, and his hands shook as he checked his rifle. Maya Foster was already organizing defensive positions, and her team spread out among the crystal formations surrounding the temple entrance, and everyone knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but no one was backing down. The war had come to the Temple of First Flame, and everything that happened next would determine the fate of countless worlds across the galaxy. The Velkari warriors descended from their assault craft like avenging angels, and their armor gleamed like oil on water in the alien sunlight, and Daniel counted at least 30 elite soldiers in each. One was 7 feet of armored death, carrying weapons that made human firearms look like toys from a child's play set. Lieutenant Maya Foster shouted for everyone to take defensive positions, and her team spread out among the crystalline formations that surrounded the temple entrance, and everyone checked their weapons, knowing that this fight would determine everything. Daniel crouched behind a massive pillar, and his rifle felt inadequate against what was coming, but he gripped it tightly anyway and through the temple entrance behind him. He could see Silvara and Nethys positioned on the central platform with Dr. Torres and her team frantically setting up transmission equipment around them. First Valkyrie warrior stepped forward, and his armor seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and when he spoke his voice was amplified by his suit's speakers and carried easily across the distance between them. He announced himself as Commander Varthok, First Blade of Emperor Kelthus, and he demanded that Princess Silvara surrender herself immediately, and if she did, then her human allies would be spared and allowed to live, but if she refused, then he would reduce the ancient temple to atoms and everyone inside it would. From inside the temple, Silvara's voice rang out clear and musical, even in defiance, and she told the commander to inform her father that she would not be his pawn anymore, and the age of chains was ending. Today, Commander Varthak laughed, and the sound was like grinding stone, and he told his warriors to advance and take the princess by force. The battle began in chaos, and the Valkyrie weapons tore chunks out of the crystal formations with each shot, and Maya's team returned fire with everything they had, but it was like trying to stop a hurricane with harsh words. Daniel fired in controlled bursts and picked his targets carefully into Valkyrie. Warriors fell when their shields were overwhelmed, but 3 more immediately took their place, and they kept advancing steadily toward the temple stairs. Inside the temple, the ritual had begun, and Silvara and Nethys stood together on the platform with their hands and claws touching the crystalline. Heart and light blazed up around them, forming a column that pierced the darkness. Above, the symbols on the floor began to move and rotate in complex patterns that made Daniel's eyes hurt when he tried to watch, and the entire temple started humming with power. Dr. Torres worked at her equipment and monitored energy readings that were going off the scale. And she shouted that the resonance was building, but the containment field overhead was interfering and they needed more time. Silvera's voice emerged, strained and different, and she said the equations were flowing through them like a river, and she could feel every chain across 1,000 worlds and every dragon trapped in servitude, and the pain was overwhelming. These roared, and the sound shook the temple to its foundations, and the dragons said they would endure together no matter what outside. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and 2 of Maya's team were down injured by energy blasts that had gotten through their cover, and the Valkyrie had reached the stairs and were beginning their ascent. Daniel fell back and joined 3 others in a last defensive line at the temple threshold, and his ammunition was running low, and his hands were shaking, but he kept firing. Commander Varthak strode up the stairs, and his personal shield shimmered around him like a heat mirage, and Maya fired a full burst at him, but the shots splashed harmlessly against his defenses. Commander raised his weapon to fire back, and then froze. The temple behind them exploded with light, and the entire structure became incandescent, and every symbol blazed like a small sun, and energy poured upward, punching through the temple roof and shooting into the sky inside. Silvara and Nethys were screaming, and the platform beneath them had begun to crack with fractures, spreading outward like spider webs, and more energy channeled through their linked forms. Dr. Torres's equipment sparked and died, completely overloaded, and the scientists shouted over the roar of power that the transmission was active, and the unbinding equations were broadcasting on quantum frequencies that every dragon in the Empire would receive. Daniel abandoned his defensive position and sprinted into the temple, and he had to shield his eyes against the blazing light, and Silvara's body had become translucent with energy visible beneath. Her skin, like lightning trapped in a bottle. Nethys was the same, and the dragon's scales glowed white-hot. And they were both locked in the transmission, unable or unwilling to break free, even though it was clearly destroying them. Silvara's voice was barely recognizable, and it echoed with strange harmonics, and she said she could feel the chains breaking, but there were so many, and they all needed to be free. Daniel understood with sudden, horrible clarity that she was burning herself up and trying to break every chain simultaneously, instead of just sending the signal and trusting others to finish the work. He did the only thing he could think of and ran to the platform and grabbed Silvara's arm. Energy hit him like a meteor, and pain exploded through every nerve in his body, and his mind was suddenly connected to something vast and ancient, and he saw dragons scattered across the cosmos like stars. He felt their chains like phantom limbs pulling and constricting, and he understood in one crystalline moment of clarity what Silvara was trying to accomplish and why it was impossible for one person alone. So he added his strength to hers. It was a drop in an ocean, in a human consciousness, joining forces with an alien princess and an ancient dragon, but somehow, impossibly, it helped, and the energy stabilized and found a new balance with his presence grounding the circuit. Daniel gasped out the word together and said they would do this together, and it was not her sacrifice alone, but their choice, and everyone working as one. Silvara's eyes met his, and purple met brown, and alien met human, and princess met lieutenant, and in that moment they understood each other completely. She redirected the energy flow and stopped trying to break every chain herself, and instead shaped the transmission into something cleaner and more focused, and it became a call to action rather than one person's martyrdom. Throughout the galaxy, dragons raised their heads and felt the equations burning through their consciousness, and they understood that they could free themselves if they chose on. 1,000 worlds chains began to shatter outside the temple. Commander Varthok watched in horror as his communication equipment lit up with emergency reports, and dragon rebellions were breaking out everywhere, and slave dragons were turning on their masters, and entire fleets were going dark as their bonded dragons refused to cooperate. The commander whispered that the emperor and the entire empire was collapsing, and everything they had built was crumbling. The light in the temple faded gradually, and Silvara and Nethius and Daniel collapsed on the cracked platform, and they were smoking and exhausted but alive, and all three of them were breathing. Dr. Torres staggered over with her face smudged with soot but grinning wildly, and she said the transmission had completed successfully, and the containment field had failed because the ships maintaining it had lost their dragon drive. She reported that they were getting messages from across the sector, and it was chaos out there, and beautiful, liberating chaos, and the empire that had stood for 5,000 years was tearing itself apart. Struggled to sit up, and her skin had regained its normal soft glow, and she looked at Daniel with something like wonder in her purple eyes, and she said he should not have touched her, because the energy could have killed him. Daniel managed a weak smile and said that could've was not good enough for him anymore, and sometimes people had to try impossible things, even when the odds were terrible. Nethies rumbled her agreement, and the dragon's voice was warm and affectionate, and she said that pack was stronger together, and they had proven that. Today Commander Varthak appeared at the temple entrance, and his weapon was lowered and behind him. His warriors stood uncertain and listening to reports of their empire's collapse, and the commander looked at Silvara with something that might have been respect. He asked what would happen now that her father's reign was over. Silvara rose on shaky legs with Daniel and Nethies steadying her, and she looked every inch a royal heir. Despite being covered in stone dust and scorch marks, she said they would rebuild and create the empire her ancestors had meant to forge, and it would be one of partnership, not domination, and it would not be easy because there would be resistance and chaos, and perhaps even civil war, but for the first time in 5,000 years, they had a chance at real PCI. Turned to the assembled humans, and her expression softened. She said that humanity had earned the eternal gratitude of the Velkari people, and they had stood together when they had every reason to turn away, and she would not forget Ambassador Laura Mitchell's voice crackled over the communication system and reported that they were receiving dozens of diplomatic requests from across the galaxy, and it seemed the universe had just gotten much more interesting and complicated. Silver laughed, and the sound was like crystal bells, and she said the ambassador was about to become very busy, because the empire was fragmenting and every faction would want humanity's support. She looked specifically at Daniel and asked him if he thought there was